Welcome to the session today on the future of data archiving and our Q&A session with our panelists here are all experts in open data and publishing and the like. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that this is an event that's sponsored by the BES, of course the host of today's meeting. The BES actually publishes a series of guides useful to people publishing. One of the more recent guides that's relevant to today's discussion is this one here, A Guide to Data Management in Ecology and Evolution. If you're interested in getting a copy of these, they're online as PDFs, but we also have a lot of printed copies up here that you're welcome to come grab before you head out at the end of the event. So today we're going to be talking about data archiving. So I wanted to give you just a tiny bit of background before I introduce our panelists, to give you some context for why we're having this event and why this is such a big issue for the BES and I think more broadly for ecology in general. You may know that the BES has adopted a policy that applies to all 5 of their journals. This policy, I just have a little excerpt of it here, but if you just focus on the words that are in bold, the BES is now requiring as a condition for publication that authors make access to their data or simulation models, things of that sort, available to all readers of those papers. So we require that data be archived in some public archive that's available to basically anybody as a condition for publication in our journals. The BES adopted this policy in September 2011 at the BES meeting held in Sheffield. The Publications Committee discussed the issue. It had been discussed for a number of years, but we discussed it and then officially adopted it. And as of January 1, 2014, this is no longer just encouraged, we actually require this as a condition for publication. That's, of course, led to lots of questions in the community, which is what brings us together for today's meeting. Where did this policy come from? Why are we doing this? Well, I think the current discussion actually goes back to about 2004 when the ESA in the United States created this joint working group on data sharing and archiving. They had a small workshop and agreed that this is a big deal and scheduled a series of meetings that were hosted by 2 organizations, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis in Santa Barbara, or NCES, and the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, or NESCENT, which is in North Carolina. Starting in 2006, they had a series of meetings. The BES was asked to participate in those meetings, so we had representatives there. Actually, I was at the first couple of those meetings, where we discussed the need for open data associated with publications. Not surprisingly, both of these organizations, NESCENT and NCES, are synthesis organizations. They're organizations of people that are mining basically the published literature to do broader syntheses, meta-analyses, and the like, to basically see what we can learn from the broader literature beyond individual studies. These meetings and the people at those meetings, which included a lot of journal editors, gave rise to a policy called the Joint Data Archiving Policy, or commonly called the JDAP, which was adopted starting in about 2010 and 2011 by a wide diversity of ecology and evolution organizations and societies, publishers. The BES then adopted a variant of that. We didn't adopt the JDAP sort of literally, we rewrote it, but we used it as a model and began requiring that data be archived for papers published in our journals. These meetings are also what gave rise to Dryad. In fact, the original name of the meetings was about creating a data center. And the data center that was created as an outcome of those events was what you now know as Dryad. And the policy that came out of those meetings was primarily, that many journals adopted, is called the JDAP. So why was this considered such a big deal in ecology? Well, as I noted, that there are a lot of organizations, these 2 in particular, that are interested in synthesis of the published literature. And one of the things that was coming out of that is that it's actually very hard to find real data, raw data for papers. It's been a long-standing practice of a lot of journals and a long-standing practice of a lot of granting agencies and a lot of universities to require that data collected or used to support publications be shared. This is not a new thing. It's been a standard requirement. For example, the NSF in the United States has long since required that you actually share your data. But those sorts of requirements are rarely enforced. There have been a number of studies where people have gone out and asked, how successful are you when you ask for data? And data are actually commonly not shared because they're lost. They're no longer in file formats people can read, or sometimes people just choose not to share them. There's also been this long history of having public archives. Everybody's heard of GenBank probably, which goes back to 1982. There are lots of others. I've only listed a couple examples here, like Treebase goes back to 1994. There's the NERC data centers, which are a number of different data centers. The Data Observation Network for Earth, or Data One, which is a set of data centers. These sorts of things have existed for a long time. But again, the problem is that all of this data sharing has been informal, and requirements by agencies, requirements imposed by journals on their authors have largely been not enforced. They've been recommended. Even if they say they're required, they're not enforced. And that leads to problems with people that are trying to access data. It's just not available as readily as we'd like it to be. So a lot of people have argued we need a less informal way to share and store data. I would argue that actually we need to go beyond that, and that there's a new perspective emerging in publishing, that papers that we submit to journals are currently basically just a summary of the data sets and the experiments that we're doing. Of course, we have insights in them, we have a lot of our own interpretation in them, but they are basically just a summary of what we've been doing. And I think the new perspective is that data is not something we build our papers on. Data is actually part of our publications. Our publications need to include data as a component of that. That both guarantees preservation of that data, but it also allows manuscripts to serve as metadata for data, so that that data are now available to everyone to use, and for new uses, maybe reanalysis, often new uses, maybe for teaching, all sorts of different reasons. And that's what gives rise to our topic today, is I will argue that data archiving and data sharing policies are here to stay. They're becoming really widely adopted. Granting agencies are getting even more serious about them. All throughout the literature, not just in ecology and evolution, this is becoming more of an expected practice. And this new philosophy, this new perspective on publishing, I think is the new norm. And so today, we want to basically have a panel of experts who I'll introduce in a moment that are here to talk about their perspective on this sort of new data archiving, data sharing world, and then open it up for discussion with the audience to ask questions and raise issues that you think are important for where we should be going, both the BES and the community more generally in the future. So here's a brief outline of what we're going to do today. Sort of 5 different sections. I'm first going to let each of the panelists tell you a little bit about their perspective on the problem, so you know where they're coming from. And then we'll go through sort of 4 general sections. We'll talk about effective data sharing. What do we need to do to make data sharing actually effective in the community? What should be the etiquette for users of shared data? And sort of vice versa, what should be appropriate etiquette or good practices for people that are sharing data? And then lastly, we'll have some sort of general thoughts on the future of data sharing and where things are going. Data arching. Okay, there's a typo in there. Let me start, before I introduce our panelists, by acknowledging the people who coordinated this. Even though I'm the one standing up here talking, I didn't actually do basically any of the coordinating beyond making the slides. Simon here, Alice, who I think is in the back, ready to take questions. Kate Harrison and Eric Newton, who are both sitting up here, are the coordinators of the event. Kate is also going to be on Twitter. I'll give you a Twitter handle in just a moment. You can follow some of the discussion on Twitter using that Twitter handle, or you can submit questions to us through that Twitter handle, and Kate will be asking them of the panelists. This is me. I'm Charles Fox. I'm the editor of Functional Ecology. I'm also a member of Dryad's board of directors, so I certainly don't come without a strong opinion on this issue. And I'm a faculty member, evolutionary ecologist at the University of Kentucky. I'll be moderating our discussion. We have 5 panelists. Liz Ferguson, sitting down there waving at us. Liz Ferguson is vice president for editorial development at Wiley. She's been a major leader in Wiley's open access initiatives. She's also very involved in a lot of other open access and open data initiatives. She's on the Dryad board of directors. She's on Data One's external advisory board. And she has just a lot of experience in publishing and a lot of experience in issues related to open science, open data, and open access. Natalie Cooper here is from the Natural History Museum in London. She's on the publications committee of the BES, so she's well sort of involved in publications with us. She's been involved in lots of discussions about the future of BES publications. Her research uses data from lots of different sources and is reliant to some extent on open data, and she's generated and made use of a number of open data sets. Catherine Harrison, thank you. She's from NERC here in UK. It's UK's Natural Environment Research Council. She manages the submission of NERC data to, well, it's easier to read it, to the Environmental Information Data Center, long phrase. I'm not from the UK, so I'm not used to saying NERC or telling people what NERC is. She supports NERC-funded scientists in data management planning, and she's been very involved in basically promoting data citation and usage of open data. James Peace Higgins here, Director of Science at the British Trust for Ornithology. He's got a long history of working on conservation biology and birds. Lots and lots of publications in conservation biology. Now he's providing strategic oversight of the British Trust for Ornithology Science, including research and monitoring programs, and he's a leader in BTO's climate change research. And then last up we have Mark Thorley. Mark is the head of science information for UK's Natural Environment Research Council, NERC again. There were so many things I could have put on this list, so I just put a couple of key points on here to note that he's been very involved in a number of initiatives for open science and open data, and he's been a primary contributor to just a whole bunch of things here. I'll let you browse. He's also on the advisory panel of Nature's Data Journal Scientific Data. So very, very involved in these issues. Okay, so this is primarily going to be a discussion and answer, a question and answer discussion event. I'll start us off with a couple of questions, but then we're going to turn it over to you, and I'll only interject when the discussion seems to go a little bit stale. At some point, we'll sort of break and change topics, because we do want to stay a bit on topic as we go through the various parts of the discussion. So we welcome questions from the floor. We also welcome questions from Twitter. This is our Twitter handle here. You can follow the discussion at that Twitter handle, or you can submit questions, which we'll be sharing with the group here. The event, as I already said, is going to be live tweeted, and it's also being filmed. So if you ask a question, please hold your hand up and let us bring you a microphone so that we can actually record your question and then record the answers of the respondents. Okay, so let's jump right into our discussion here. The very first question I want to ask and give each of them a moment to respond before we move on to our first sort of big question is, what does data sharing mean to you in your role in the community that you represent? So, we want to start off?
Okay, thank you very much. So, I'm here, as you've said, as Director of Science from the British Trust for Ornithology, and for those of you who don't know you, we're an environmental research NGO. We run a lot of long-term monitoring schemes in the UK, working largely with volunteers to bring in those data, but also run a lot of professional science as well. And to see that interface between professional and volunteer based data collection and science is really important to delivering a lot of important ecological questions. So from our perspective, we're very much coming at it from a kind of data archiving, data sort of collating, long-term monitoring perspective, but also from a research perspective as well. And in that vein, part of what I want to talk about is obviously from a BTO perspective, but try and also reflect more broadly. There are other organisations out there, either bird organisations kind of internationally who've got similar models to us, or other kind of taxonomic specific organisations in the UK who I'll try and kind of represent those views as best I can as well. So in many ways, kind of open data and improving the accessibility of data is good from a number of different levels, in terms of improving the quality of science in terms of its reproducibility and the opportunity to validate those data, maintaining long-term data sets in perpetuity, and opening up more opportunities, if it can be done in this way, for sort of more science to be done, more research on those data, and more collaboration. Sharing data and knowledge is one of our strategic priorities moving forward. in our current 5-year strategy period, and to achieve that, we've just passed across 150 million presence records of bird species to NBN. That's a combination of kind of BTO data and BTO partnership data, so from schemes that we work with others on. And that's really important as a kind of making that kind of distribution information widely available through that gateway, which means that the members of the public can view that. But I think it's worth emphasising as well that there's a lot of other kind of information that isn't just the raw data that we produce, and I think in a lot of cases actually it's derived information, at least to the public and to decision makers, which is more important than the open data itself. Accounting for some of the uncertainties and some of the errors and the vagaries in the data that are out there, and producing products which take account of those and give the public and decision makers what they want, rather than just throwing a load of data at them. I suppose the final thing I want to say on the kind of potential benefits of open data is and sort of the BTO and other organisations' perspective is that yes, there's science we do ourselves, but also there's a lot of science we do in collaboration with other people. And one of the key elements to that is obviously working with people on the analyses of data. And I just wanted to kind of flag up sort of 3 potential issues, I think, which would be good to discuss, which maybe mean that open data isn't necessarily a kind of a complete panacea, and certainly there are some challenges around this, if I may. And so the first, I think, is over. So there are issues, I think, over achieving scientific quality. The second is over kind of financing, and the third is potentially over some ethical issues. So the first I want to talk about in terms of scientific quality follows on from that point that I was just talking about in terms of collaboration. So we do a lot of work in collaboration with others. And that collaboration works best where those who are analysing the data are in good communication and close communication with those who were involved in collecting those data, to avoid misinterpretations, to avoid errors occurring, or to assist with the interpretation of those data. And one of the concerns, I think, over kind of an open data model is that can potentially break the mechanism between those who are analysing the data talking and communicating and having a close collaborative relationship with those from whom the data originated. And that can also lead to inefficiencies. If you don't have that communication, there could be multiple people, and we know of cases where this has occurred, working on the same question kind of independently of each other. And we've actually had an important role in terms of putting some of those groups in communication with each other, because we've known what's going on, and that's led to a greater scientific benefit. And the only reason that occurred is because people were coming to us asking the data, then asking us for the data, and then we would provide them with the data. And because we had that kind of interface, that then created an overall better benefit. So I think having some degree of check and way of communicating with the data originators is a really important way of trying to minimise the risks of reductions in scientific quality through open data that doesn't seem to be there at the moment. Financially, I want to look at thinking about. So this is probably largely an issue for organisations like ourselves who have no core funding. So we're a charity, and I said there are a number of other organisations out there, which produces 2 issues. So we're involved in the collection and the maintenance of schemes which provide long-term data, and that requires quite a lot of resource. Even though that kind of citizen science-based approach is a much more efficient way to achieving long-term data collection than others, it still requires resourcing. And part of that resourcing comes from our ability to conduct research on the back of some of the data that's collected. And there's a risk, because there's a risk that kind of income stream can potentially be diminished or lost through open data. The second risk is around preferably needing to or wanting to engage with people who would want to use our data at a very early stage, and ideally to be involved at the proposal stage, so we can actually get some resourcing to facilitate the collaboration and the communication and the exchange that I've just talked about. Where we don't get that, it can be quite a challenge for us, because our staff have got their own projects to work on, to then squeeze in the time that's needed to help support some of the data that's done, some of the analyses that are done on our data, if we don't know about it. And quite often we've got people coming and using the data potentially in quite a short time frame, and that can then lead to perhaps not as positive a discussion with us from an external data user perspective as we would like and as they would probably like, because we're having to squeeze it in amongst other things. And also, there's only a certain amount of that kind of engagement we can do because we're using up our resources that we would otherwise be using on other things. Certainly when that collaboration and that data use is in line with our strategic priorities and so on, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just makes it much more difficult to plan for. And then thirdly, and I think if, this is a sort of more general issue, and I think there is a risk that certainly is recognised in the literature but hasn't been fully discussed or dealt with, I think, about, particularly in the current climate of unlikely to be increasing public sector funds for some of these schemes, that there's a risk of being able to undermine the financial model of some of the long-term monitoring schemes, which gives really important data for decision making. And then the third thing I just want to touch on briefly is over some of the ethical issues. So I think the positives around open data from an ethical perspective are really well known, but also I think there are some potential costs. And I think those are particularly around the individuals who are involved in significant kind of intellectual or financial or organisational costs and investments in terms of some of the long-term monitoring that's undertaken. And there's a risk that those individuals or organisations are then less able or unable to benefit from that investment, particularly if you end up publishing something on a very extensive long-term data set, which is then either through requirements for a journal or for other mechanisms then available for other people to address lots of other issues that you would also want to address, but you're potentially in less of a good position to do that. And that's particularly important from a kind of volunteer perspective, from our perspective, where we have a lot of volunteers who are investing incredibly in the data collection that they're undertaking. And the only reason they submit and are happy for us to kind of provide those data, they see us almost as a kind of guardian or a gatekeeper of those data sets, and I think would be extremely reluctant for some of those data to be made available in an open access way. And I do know of individuals who are reluctant to share with us for that reason, because there is their own research that they want to be doing around their data, and I'm pretty sure therefore the further you go down the open data model, those data would then just become less and less available to the ecological community, rather than trying to foster a communication that then leads to collaboration. So to summarise, I think there's lots of benefits, but I think what we would want to look to, and I think lots of other organisations like us, are solutions that would maximise the availability of data to the community, but in a way that doesn't have kind of unintended negative consequences in terms of reducing collaboration, reducing the likelihood of some of these really important schemes being able to maintain themselves, and basically leading to a number of sort of negative consequences.
Very good. I think a number of the issues you've touched on are things that have been coming up in commentaries in the literature as well, and I think we should come back to as we progress through this, the cost to the data generators, the financing issues, both for maintaining sort of open data archives, but also for impacts on financing of the organizations producing the data, and certainly a variety of ethical issues we still need to address. Let's move on to our second
Hi,
person
I'm
here.
Catherine Harrison, and I work in one of NERC's data centres, so I'm coming from a data centre perspective. I work for the Environmental Information Data Centre, which takes in data from terrestrial and freshwater sciences, so it's quite a broad range of data that we deal with. Primarily we deal with data from NERC-funded researchers, and for NERC-funded researchers, depositing data and getting support from us as a data centre is free at the point of use, so you don't have to pay to deposit your data if you're NERC-funded. Data sharing to me means a researcher making their data available for the long term so that other people can use it without having to contact the data generator. So it means depositing data in a format that it's non-proprietary, so it's not going to go out of date in the long term. It's well described, there's plenty of information that means people can look at it, whether they're a journal reviewing the data or someone who wants to reuse the data, can look at it and understand what it means, what things are, how it can be used, and making sure that it's available in the long term. So it's not just a short-term solution. So in 5-10 years you'll be able to look back and Also, you can cite the data, so we provide DOIs for data so that people can get credit for the data that they're depositing at the data centre.
Thank you very much. Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I work at the Natural History Museum in London, so I'm here as the perspective of a researcher, I suppose. So pretty much all of my research relies on open data to some extent. So my PhD research back in the day involved using a large phylogeny, which was published and was freely available, and a large data set of mammal traits. I also collect data from museum specimens, which is why I'm based at the Natural History Museum, but that's kind of another form of open data because all those specimens were collected by other people, but they are open to the public to come in, well, not necessarily the public, but researchers to come in and collect data from those specimens. So I think even though I might collect my own data, a lot of my research does rely on other things like climate data, phylogenies, and the kinds of stuff that sometimes when people are talking about not wanting to share their data, they kind of forget that they're actually using these other publicly available data sets to actually ask questions, not just using the stuff that they've purely collected. So I come at it from kind of that angle and really in encouraging certainly my research group and people I have contact with into sharing data more widely if possible.
I think that's a good point. We often use data sets that we don't think of as public data because they're generated by government agencies or other things that we just make use of, but they are actually data collected by people for the public. Liz.
Okay, so I'm Liz and I'm here representing the community of publishers, and I know there are others in the room, so I'm sure they'll say if they have a different perspective on this. I've been involved in data sharing since pretty much the advent of the JDAT that Chuck referred to earlier. And what it really means to me as a publisher is that we can give people an opportunity to show much wider outputs of the research that they've been generating over the course of a 3 or 5 year project, however long it may be, rather than taking the output of that research and squishing it into 12 PDF flat pages with a couple of figures and a couple of graphs. We can provide much richer connections through to the wider outputs of research. And when I talk about data, I typically do use it as shorthand for multiple other outputs. So it could be software, it could be code, it could be all sorts of other things. I see it as a way of enriching the content that we publish, both for the author and for the reader. So the reader who has a deeper level of interest in an article than just browsing it can very quickly and very easily get into a much deeper level of understanding. I see data sharing and proper archiving as a way of getting rid of the curse of supporting information. I think that that is a disservice that publishers have done for good reason. It started out with the right intent, but we have been taking data from people for many years that they've provided, and it typically ends up in an undescribed form at the end of an article, and you may not even be aware that it's there until you stumble upon it by accident. So having proper places that journals can help enable the archiving of data in has to be more rewarding for everyone concerned, I would hope. I think as well that when it comes to the role of publishers and journals in this space, having access to the data and being able to point to where it resides creates an extra level of trust and validation in the material that we're publishing on your behalf than we're otherwise able to do. To my regret, there are too many questions around the validity of scientific research these days. Being able to add in yet more pieces that allow others to come in and interrogate and see if they can reproduce the analysis or do something different with it that at least leads to the same kind of result has to have the end consequence of further increasing trust in the scientific process. As Catherine said, being able to give DOIs for data means that researchers can get greater reward and attribution for the work that they're doing. And finally, this isn't necessarily my opinion, but we did a few focus groups about 18 months ago with researchers in life and geosciences around their perspectives on data sharing, and they told us that something that publishers could do by helping researchers handle their data is make peer review better. And that has to be good for everybody. And the reason that they said that was because they felt that as authors, if they made their data available during the peer review process, they would either be more likely to have their paper accepted because reviewers would be able to see that they had at least been trustworthy or whatever in providing their data. And as reviewers, people felt that they would be more capable of reviewing a paper quicker if instead of getting halfway through a manuscript and realizing they couldn't assert whether something actually made sense in the paper or not, being able to dip quickly into the data that accompanied it would help answer that instead of prolong the review process. So I think there are lots of things that publishers can do to enable data sharing. It's evidenced by journals like the BES journals, like Molecular Ecology, which has had a data archiving requirement for a number of years, and which in just 3 years got over 1,000 data sets out into the public domain as a consequence.
Thanks, Liz. Mark?
Okay, so I'm Mark Thorley. I work for the Natural Environment Research Council, where I have this grand title of Head of Science Information, which doesn't really mean much. I've been working in research data now since 1990. I used to work at British Antarctic Survey as a data manager. So I want to come at this as a funder perspective. And the first thing I'm going to say is I don't actually like the term data sharing. Data sharing implies that you're going to share it with the people you like, and maybe you're going to make decisions about who you share it with. It's mine to share. As a funder, and NERC has been doing data for a long time. So NERC had a policy back in 1991, we had our first policy around data. And it was very much driven by the sort of organisation NERC is, that it's a recognition in environmental sciences. You can't go out there tomorrow and collect, what yesterday's climate was. There has always been a recognition that the data we collect in environmental sciences has a long-term value. You can't go back and recreate those data. So we've always had a focus within NERC on saying, well, if you are funded by NERC, we would like you to offer a copy of the data you collect back to one of our 5 data centres, where we'll manage and make those data available to the community on your behalf, kind of thing. So the phrase we use is reuse and repurposing. It's a recognition that data can be reused for other things, basically other forms of research, but they have a wider use as well beyond that for the research they were collected. So a lot of the work I do at the moment, working with my colleagues in the innovation team in NERC, is how we can actually engage business more actively in using the vast collections of environmental data we have within NERC to really support the work they want to advance, help them solve business problems with an environmental basis. So I think we have to recognise it's not just about sharing data for the wider research community, it's sharing and making data available to whoever needs it to answer real-world questions and problems. At the same time, what's come on in the last 5-7 years or so is this whole area around the robustness of the research process, which Liz was referring to. I think there was a report back in 2012, Science as an Open Enterprise, came from the Royal Society, which itself was a result of the issues around the leaked emails from UEA and ClimateGate, and some of the questions which are raised about practices around data there. I think an awful lot of researchers, myself included, would have said, there but for the grace of God go I. Can I stick my hand on the data I created 20 years ago? Probably not. I actually do have the data from my honours thesis. I found it the other day. I still have a box of punch cards. Somewhere where they can be read, I don't know, but I still have the data set. But it's around what have we got? Research is changing, and we're working to a digital age where there is much more data being collected, much more data being used. We have to find ways of opening that data up to ensure we can authenticate the research, look at the robustness and reproducibility of the research. Obviously Liz has talked a little bit about that. So that, again, as funders, is a big driver for us. How can we demonstrate that the research we fund is of the highest quality? So part of that is ensuring the data that underpin that research is open. So NERC has been very big at doing a lot of work in open data for many years now, but all the other research funders, all the other research councils now have policies around open data. Some are much more late to the party than others, but I think there's a general recognition now that whatever the field of your research, the data that underpins that research has to be available for scrutiny and has to be available for reuse. There are some really tricky questions, and someone referred to some of those earlier, about issues around consent and confidentiality and ethics. But I think, to me, the general trend now is towards a much more open future for data.
All right, thank you very much. I'll start us off with our first question, and then we're going to open it up to the floor As I noted, we're going to structure our questions into a couple of different sections. I want to start off with the topic, this sort of general topic of what are some of the important considerations for effective data sharing. And I'll start off actually with a question that comes right out of two of your comments. So Mark doesn't like the term sharing, and James, you noted that there's a real advantage to having authors be required or data reusers be required to contact your organization so that you can help get people in contact with each other. And so one of the things that many of us have argued, I certainly think, although I maybe have to rethink this, is that open data means when the data is out there, people can use it and nobody should have control over it anymore. That's what it means to be open. I think you would probably argue that there's real disadvantages to that. And I wonder if everybody could talk just a little bit on their perspective on what does it mean to share? Should you have to be in contact with the original authors? Should archives have a screening process for who should access data, or at least require that they be in the middle of the process? Or should it just be out there for people to use? And even though there are problems that will come from that, those are just things we have to deal with. And I suspect I know what the two extreme perspectives are, but I wonder if you could elaborate on that or discuss it. You want to start? Sure.
To kick off, I mean, I've already kind of talked a little bit about that, and it is worth bearing in mind. We're talking about kind of data providers and data users, but at least from my perspective, and a lot of similar organisations, there's also the volunteers who are involved in collecting the data as well, who often actually don't. So you're actually potentially talking about data from thousands of individuals, and with a kind of mix of views as to what should be done with those data. So it's potentially in some cases even more complicated than that kind of bipartite division. But I think it's not so much necessarily around kind of what you should or shouldn't do, but kind of there are different kind of consequences, and I think there is a risk, as I said, about making it easier for people not to talk to each other, if I can put it that way. I think results in poorer science, which can't be good, I mean, I'm interested in other views about how we can kind of make the current system, or sort of make open data work in a way which doesn't deliver that. But I know from my own experience, from other colleagues and from other people, that if you provide information out there and people can access it and use it without talking to you, then they almost invariably will, and you only find out about it once it's been published, or even perhaps sometimes even quite a long time after it's been published, and that can lead to to errors occurring, misinterpretations, misuses of data, and so on.
Would it possibly be a solution for journals to have a policy that if someone is reusing data, that journals require that you demonstrate that you've been in contact with the original authors? Is that something that would solve the problem? You're shaking your head.
No, I think if you're writing a journal paper and you refer to someone else's work from a journal paper, you wouldn't contact them and say, "Hi, I'm just going to refer to your paper. Is that all right? Do we need to talk about this?" There's a citation for that person's original work, and you put that into your paper, and then you do that with all the references. So,
right.
From my perspective, I don't think that they need to have that.
But is it a little different if the sort of major component of the paper is someone else's data? Is that a distinction that's not?
I think it's cited correctly, but we're coming from slightly different viewpoints, where his data is being collected by individuals, or whereas the data that I deal with, it's publicly funded data. So where I see it should be open and you shouldn't need to talk to people. We do have licensing. We like to. There is a license, but it's very sort of loose licensing. But when it's different data and it's collected by individuals, it is a bit more complicated. But for me, in an open data world, I'd like to see you be able to just use data without having to contact the originator, and be able to understand it without having to ask them questions.
But surely you could see there must be advantage. So surely it would be better if the person who is using data in that context then had the communication with the person who originated. That would be likely to increase the quality of the work in
Not
some
necessarily,
circumstances.
because they could be coming from a completely different viewpoint, and maybe being a little bit detached means they could look at the different data in a different way. And if it is well described with use limitations, So say you've created some data and it would be ridiculous to use it for a certain thing because you didn't collect this data or that data, and that's clearly documented. Then if someone then goes and uses it inappropriately, you know, you've written that it shouldn't have been, so that's fair enough. But I don't think they need to speak to someone. I think it should be standing alone so that you can understand it and use it without having to talk to them. I mean, obviously you can see who's created the data, and if it's in a field that you're working on, maybe it's good you want to get in contact if you want to do collaboration. So you've got a name, you know who to contact, but that's the same as if it was a journal paper. You'd see there's someone in America who does a similar thing. Oh, I could get in touch with them because I'm interested in their work, but you wouldn't contact them and say, I'm writing a paper and it disagrees with what you said in your paper and I think we should talk about this before I publish my paper. You just do it. So, but it's a different viewpoint. I don't know if you...
I think, to me, I mean, there's one thing between having a policy, and then I think it's how we can develop the community norms around how we work with other people's data. Yeah, I mean, you could say, well, I've published. You wouldn't always refer back to an author of a paper if you were going to cite a paper in your work, and you're free to misinterpret and, you know, totally go off on the wrong end of a stick about what someone had written in their paper. And in theory, we have to allow people the freedom to do that with data sets. But the best work will come out by working in collaboration. I think too often people think the data themselves are valuable. Yeah, the data have a value, but what really is valuable is your knowledge of those data. It's what you as the researcher who collects those data can add to those data. The extra depth, and I think that's where the real power comes through open data, is to build those collaborations where people work together. But yeah, I think we have to accept that if we make stuff open, people will misinterpret it, abuse it, and do whatever, but we have to develop those norms where if you've used data, you cite that data set, you're very clear, people are then free to disagree with your work and say, actually, they've totally misused that data set, you know, I wouldn't, you know, I don't think that's a very good paper because they've misused the data. In the same way, we disagree with people's written papers currently.
Yeah, I think you hit on a particularly important point among many, which is we need to develop a set of community norms, and those are still developing. They're unset, and there's a lot of disagreement, but that's what we need to sort out.
The policy is running ahead,
yes,
to some extent.
Yes, which is typical. And I mean, even when things like GenBank, you know, one of the early archives came out, you know, it was ahead of its time, and it took a long time before community norms were set and are now widely accepted. Liz?
So I would agree with everything Mark said and with what Catherine said too, and I think my answer to the basic question is, should you have to? No, you shouldn't. The principle of open data is that it's open and it's there. Should you, though, do so? Yes, absolutely, in part to improve the quality of the work that you'll do as a consequence, and also because we are still in the very early days of data archiving, whatever term you prefer, Mark, and metadata standards are hugely variable. So Catherine's point about if the data are there and if they're well described, you should just be able to do whatever you wish is great, but often data aren't well described, and I think we've got a long way to go. But I'm also aware of putting too many barriers into place that make it even harder for people to make their data publicly available at the moment too.
I think, again, there are some real issues with some of these, what you might call citizen science data sets, where the BTO is, you know, especially good at creating and curating those data. And we've got to work it out, you know, how are there limits to some levels of openness where the data collectors themselves are not bound by any one funder policy. You know, they're doing it because for other reasons. We've got to just work this out, I think, the way forward.
Excellent. Let's turn to the audience for questions. Are there questions? We got microphones here. So.
Andrew Davis, Max Planck Institute for Chemical Ecology in Jena, Germany. There are two observations I'd like to make. The first one is that I think we risk getting confused because there are two different topics here. One is the making available of data which has been used to support a publication. And the other question is making data available to a wider range of people when that data hasn't already been used in publications. And the conditions pertaining to those two different themes must be different. They're really different. You can't demand of somebody who has collected data that they should make their data available if it hasn't been used for a publication, but if it has been used for a publication, there is a justification for demanding and making it available.
If it's
and
publicly
testable.
funded data, though, if it's been generated by public funds, then you can say you must make it available, whether it's been referred to in a publication or not.
That's not actually the case. There's a large amount of state-generated data which is not made available and would never be made available. Just the fact that it is collected with funding from the state does not necessarily mean that it has to be made available. But these,
well, if you're taking, unfortunately, if you're taking money from any of the UK research councils and many of the funders, there are stipulations that go with that. We would expect you to lodge various data.
Yeah,
But I agree, there are some public data sets out there which aren't available.
yes, but my point is that there are two different questions
Okay.
here, and we
Yeah.
shouldn't get them confused. My other observation is that I don't see in either of these themes, I don't see where the legal liability resides for data that is made openly available. If I make a mistake in epidemiological data and that data is then used for wildlife vaccination program and things go horribly wrong, am I still responsible? Or is the data repository or the data curator responsible? How are we going to test who is legally liable for mistakes in data if the data has left the collector and moved into the public arena?
Okay, well, to answer that particular question, obviously it depends on the legal regime you're operating within, but certainly one of the things, there's a group called the Belmont Forum, which are the international funders of global change research. So it's NERC, NSF, I'm trying to remember who the other major, NERC and NSF are the principal people behind the Belmont Forum. And one of the things we have in that, we're developing a working group looking at all of these legal aspects to provide much better legal guidance on some of these liability issues. So yeah, there are still questions to be asked.
Yeah, there are still
But-
questions.
But again, it depends on the legal jurisdiction you're in, which again is why we tend to apply things like licenses and indemnifiers and waiver statements to data sets. I think at the moment you have to say, use it at your peril, with best professional endeavour, kind of thing. You've taken the data set, you've used it, you'll push it as far as it can go, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, but it just doesn't appear to be a very clear situation.
Okay, it's one of these things we're still going to have to get to grips with in some of these areas around open data.
Which is why I wanted to float it in, in this forum.
I think the distinction between types of data associated with papers, and data that is, say, supported by granting agencies, I think that distinction is really important because some of the commentaries that have been critical of the journal data archiving movements, I think, are conflating them. And so that's a real key distinction there. They possibly should be treated differently.
I mean, just on that, there are potentially some circumstances where that distinction gets blurred, and I think that's that's where some of the difficulties can arise. But then, I would hope that there are mechanisms then in place potentially around that are already available through potentially embargoes or whatever to try and deliver the open data and the requirements from a journal perspective, while still protecting the others who originated those data.
Yeah, there's also, from the journal perspective, the BES journals, at least, can't speak for other journals, do make an exception for people using data that they don't own. So if a researcher was using data that's owned by BTO, but the researcher doesn't own it, we do make exceptions in the requirements for that kind of data. Got a couple of people in the back.
Okay, thanks. I come from the genetic side of ecology, and this is something we've been sort of struggling with for a long time. I think the first thing to point out is that from the genetic point of view, if you've got a sequence, whether that's a DNA sequence or a protein sequence, and you publish, it's a condition of publication that you lodge that sequence, generally GenBank. And that is an incredibly powerful research tool, both for yourself and for anyone else that wants to use it. So I think it's a question of if we do data sharing, or whatever you want to call it. I think it's when and how. So I think that's the first thing. When we've had a similar set of discussions like we're having today, the biggest concern has been for students who are researching, who are let's say 2/3 of the way into the PhD or postdoc, and they'll produce their first paper and they'll archive the data, and the biggest concern then is someone else will get into my data and they'll analyse it in a way that I was going to do, and they'll beat me to it. So one question, first of all, is how long is the embargo? If you put some data on there, how long is the embargo before someone else can actually use it? That's one question. And the second thing is that GenBank has been particularly good at, that's the place where the depository goes. I think for an ecology set of data, where does it go? Because if you have multiple sets of archives, then the power that you can use that becomes much more difficult because you're trying to get hold of it. And I think the third question then is actually, what do you register? What goes on to that data? It's pretty easy if you're doing a gene sequence or a protein sequence to actually register that. It's a fairly uniform thing. From an ecology point of view, the data that you get from trail cameras recording deer movement is very different from botanical survey work. So what's in there really? That's my third question.
Okay, we got a bunch of questions there. Liz, do you want to start
I
off?
can take a quick stab at some of those. I think by and large journal policies are pretty sympathetic to the kind of student circumstance that you describe. Most of the journals I know, certainly in ecology and evolution, that require data sharing will give a no questions asked 1 year embargo, and if you want to see a period longer than that, then questions will be asked and it will be subject to the discretion of the editor. And often if people are at an early stage in their PhD, that would be a reason for giving a longer embargo quite frequently. Multiple archives. So first of all, I should say, as someone who's been associated with Dryad for a long time, that I think Dryad is increasingly becoming a well-recognised home for ecological data of many different forms. One of the roles I think that publishers can help play when there are multiple archives is to make sure they are properly identified and connected up from within the narrative and the article that describes them. Chuck referred earlier to the manuscript as metadata, and I think that the published article is the very best metadata you could possibly have, and making all of those connections present in that article can be a big help. And that could refer equally to the kind of data that you might share at the point of publication, as well as some of the much earlier stage data that we were talking about earlier. I shall defer to scientists as to what goes into the data.
Well, I think just to address again that issue of multiple archives, NERC runs a series of 5 data centres. You could say, well, why don't you just run one? And you need to disentangle the issue about getting the data managed by people who actually understand the science behind the data, which is why we have our data centres based in our research centres. So the data managers, the data scientists are sitting with the people who are actually doing the science day to day and understand the context of the data. So you need to disentangle that sort of management of the intellectual component of the data from the physical management of the bits and bytes. And behind the scenes, we're moving much more towards more of a single integrated, super large data store, because we recognise once we tend to have all the data in one physical location, along with the computing power, we can start to do really new, interesting things by overlaying a huge amount of data into a really powerful processor, which is why we have the Jasmine facility down at Ruffin Lab, which is NERC funded, which is one of these new generation sort of big data, big high throughput data analysis machines. And I think that's a way that research is going to go in the future, these much more powerful compute clusters. So I think we can look to see how we can physically bring the data together, but it's still good to have the data, I won't say owned, but managed, understood by people who are behind the science, which I think is where our data's work, to some extent where Dryad works, because it's sort of grown out the community as well, so it's understood what's in there.
And from a NERC perspective, we support a 2-year embargo on data sets. So you can deposit a data set, you can have a DOI for the data set, so you can get your data, your papers sent off, and you've got a DOI and it is stored somewhere securely, but then we can hold it so you can't access the data for 2 years. And then when your paper comes out, we can lift the embargo early if it's before that. So we wouldn't take in data that was held elsewhere unless we could agree some way of that data being moved to us. So we don't want to be issuing several DOIs for one lot of data. So that's how we would do it. And I just wanted to disagree with you about saying the journal article is all the metadata you would need for a data set. The supporting documentation that we'd require actually goes above and beyond what you would put in your paper. It's really detailed, and that's so that people can understand it without having to contact the creator. So it will go into calibration, it will go into QA of your data, it will go into sampling regimes in much more detail than you might in a journal paper. So that's comments that I would like to make.
I was going to say something about this PhD student issue, because I think we should really consider early career researchers and how they fit into this data sharing or archiving, because I think they do have valid worries, like you're saying, that if they publish a paper and have to produce all the data in the first year of their PhD, they may have trouble. So a couple of things is, I think for some reason this urban legend of people getting scooped all the time by releasing data, I'm not entirely sure how true that is. So I know a lot of, so James, actually I said this at lunchtime and James came up with 3 examples, so maybe I'm wrong. But everybody else I know who said this, it's always been a friend of a friend of a friend this happened to, and there's very few very clear examples of this happening. So I would be interested if people do have examples and want to tell me privately later that we can maybe put together to try and get rid of this kind of idea. So I think embargoes help there, but also what I usually say to my students is just be a bit sensible. If you've collected a big data set and you know you're going to ask, say, 3 questions on that data set during your PhD, maybe sort of save finishing up that first paper a little bit later, so sort of in the middle of your second year rather than right at the beginning, and that might help as well. But then the other thing being, it's your data set, you know that data way better than anyone else who's going to look at it when it gets put out into the public view. So you already have this massive head start on anybody else who's going to work with it. So I think because of those things, I think it's quite rare for somebody to quickly grab a data set off the shelf and sort of do the exact same thing that you were planning on doing. So I think that's perhaps less of a worry than the students themselves think, but it's definitely a reasonable worry which we need to try and support people going through that problem. In terms of in terms of your other question as to what do you archive, I think that's really tricky, and I don't think we really, any of us got there yet with working that out. So you could just produce the sort of the spreadsheet which says here are the sightings of those deer in those camera trap videos. But I was talking to one of the students at the early careers thing, and he's got this amazing data set of coral reef fish, and it's terabytes of data, and he said he only records certain species of fish. So really you'd want those data to be somewhere, because he doesn't need to use them anymore, but it would be good if they were available for somebody who wanted to do something very different with that same data set. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it does. I mean, I haven't heard of any data being scooped. I think it's an understandable worry, but I think it becomes from a kind of PhD student's obsessive sense of this is my data, and you know, I'm just ahead of the rest of the pack. In reality, the rest of the world really isn't that interested in until there's 2 or 3 papers in. And I'm sorry if there's any PhD students in there. I think the real advantage of this data sharing is that people can do other things with it. And when the UEA story first broke, my sense of that was that people forget how much an art science is. That we collect this vast body of data and we make great editorial decisions about how we use that data. And that's actually sometimes as scientists that we forget, but every time we present a table, every time we present a summary table, every time we present a figure, we're making editorial decisions about what we consider to be important and to tell a story. Now, usually from raw data, there are other stories to be told. So I think for me, what's important to collect is who recorded the data, precisely how they collected it, so where the camera traps went, or where the quadrats went, and what the quadrat size was, and you know, those kind of things, and then just that raw data, you know, percent figure for species, and then see what happens to it later on. I'm less interested in people contacting you later down the line, because I actually think that's an irrelevancy, because it's usually that people want to do something different to your data. I think what's really pressing is that we start archiving, and we start archiving now. I have a student in here who's she's done a talk on 25 years of data, and we were 2 weeks ahead of someone retiring, and that paper set of data went in the bin and we would have lost it. That's what's really important, that this mass of data that's there now actually is archived, and we can use it 25 years, 50 years down the line, however we want to, in ways that we just can't imagine at present.
You got another question over here?
Hi, I'm going to have to really rudely leave after I've made the points. I'm so sorry, but it was just actually linked to what's been already said, but in the context of long-term data sets, so I'm very much in James's camp. In terms of this multiple archives, if I run a long-term study of individual-based animal records, and if I have to put it online for a Journal of Animal Ecology paper next year, I then might have to put a different copy on in 3 years hence for a functional ecology paper, and then a third one 3 years after that. Actually, that's not a really good way of doing things. These are living, breathing data sets. You also correct mistakes as you go along, and they might be mistakes from 10 years ago. Much the most efficient way to get the right up-to-date information is to contact the data holder, not grab a 6-year-old archive data set. So there's 2 points there, the age of the data set and the multiple copies, which are all different from each other. And the point about the PhD students is that embargoes don't work with long-term studies. Everyone knows that. If you've got a 40-year study, anyone's quite happy with 38 years, right? So a PhD student who's working on a long-term study is, in theory, and I've got an example for you, which I can tell you later, can be gazumped at any point, because that data set is quite well known. And it's not a data set that they've been quietly collecting themselves. And those guys should have the opportunity to do that work. And so the best way to do that is the person contacts the data holder, very often the supervisor of that student. Can I ask this question? He said, well, do you mind actually if this student just completes that piece of work?
Bunch of points there overlapping with the recent tree commentary as well on criticizing the data movement. Comments from the audience? Sorry?
Co-author of that paper.
Yeah, I guessed. I guessed that. Comments from the panel?
Well, I just wanted to say that dynamic data is a particular. We hold a lot of long-term studies as well, and citation of dynamic data that's constantly changing, is a real issue for us, and it's an ongoing problem, and people are working on it, but we haven't got there yet. So, yeah, hopefully there'll be a solution to that soon.
Yeah, so certainly I wouldn't expect you to split the data set up and deposit individual versions of that data set. We have to find ways of being able to reference a single, parts of a single data set, which is what Kate was referring to.
We have workarounds at the moment, but they're not ideal. We take time slices, or we take, depending on the data and how it changes, we take a whole new version with a new DOI, but it's not ideal at the moment, so we are working with other people to try and get this problem sorted.
Yeah, the multiple data sets problem is a big issue that needs to be solved. Journals, of course, only really have leverage over what's published in the journals, so the focus has been on supporting what's in your paper, but we definitely need a more holistic approach, so that's a big deal.
Which is when I think we forget one of the other key players, and the previous questioner sort of alluded to this, talking about loss of records. If somebody retired, we've lost all those data. And we forget that the research institution itself has a real responsibility in this place. So if a university or research centre wants to put its name to research coming out of its door, it has a responsibility to make sure the data that it holds is properly managed. So that the researchers as employed over time, the data are there and available to future researchers for other people to use. So to just say it's a problem for funders, it's a problem for data centres, it's a problem for publishers, yes, but I think crucially, research institutions have really got to get behind this whole area of what they do with research data. Now in the UK that is starting to change now, due to one of our sister research councils, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, has put the onus on the research institution to ensure the data collected under their funding is properly managed, otherwise the institution will no longer be eligible for research council funding. And all the research councils together, we are looking at our joint policy, our individual policies, and will be coming up with a single joint policy across all the councils. And it will look much more carefully at what the responsibility of the institution is, as opposed to the responsibility of the PI.
All right, I know we've got more questions. We'll have time to hopefully roll them in as we go. I want to change the topic just a little bit, though, and see if we can have some questions related to data reuse as people who are producing data and people will someday be reusing it, or as individuals who are themselves reusing data, what are the important things we need to consider? We've touched on a few of these things already, but are there questions sort of along these lines?
Yes.
Very good.
Hello, I'm Pen Yuan Xing from Durham University, and I would like to identify as one of the PhD students that people have been talking about all this time. So very initially, I had the same concern that some of you brought up about, if I'm 1 year into my PhD, I publish something along with my data, and then I get scooped and someone else publishes 5 other papers based on my data. Now, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I can imagine, feeling somewhat taken aback when I see people publish those 5 papers, and I think that's related to the etiquette that we're talking about right now. But I would also like to identify as a scientist. And when we do science, a very fundamental part of science is standing on the shoulders of other giants and making our shoulders available for other people to stand on. It seems to me a fundamental betrayal of science itself if we do not make our data available. Assuming this is correct, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but assuming this is correct, then the problem would be, okay, if I publish something today, someone takes my data, publishes 5 more papers on it, the problem will be I'm not getting credit for what else I would like to do with it. So this strikes me not as a problem of whether we should make data available, because it has to be, otherwise we're not doing science. The problem seems to be the system in which academia operates, how we provide credit, how we attribute people, how the publishing system works. In that, for instance, if I publish my first paper, can I, for instance, say, oh, by the way, I would also like to do these other things with this. And when other people, want to do those things before me, they have to, for instance, credit me and say, oh, this guy from, this place thought of doing this. We, went ahead and played around with it, and, here's what we found. At least they're providing me credit for originating the idea. But, in the way things work right now, I can't just publish something saying, I want to do this. I can't even be peer reviewed for a method that I'm proposing. There isn't any journal where I can propose, I want to do A, B, and C, and someone can peer review my process. I think if we can actually change the way things are published and the way credit is attributed in academia, then maybe there's a chance we can just avoid the whole problem of scooping someone else's work. And wouldn't this be better etiquette? And wouldn't this be more true to doing science itself? And like I said, I don't really know if this is right. Like, I would love to hear a perspective. Thanks.
So did you have an immediate follow-on on that?
Yeah, just a follow-up comment actually.
Okay.
So partly I really endorse the sentiment behind that statement. I'd say it's a slightly tangential issue, but a thing that's being discussed a bit in the framework of open science or replicability is the idea of having what would be called pre-registered reports, where effectively you do submit an introduction to the methods before you actually even maybe collect data, and where in some fields you get in a sense, a provisional acceptance from a journal, irrespective of what the results turn out to be. So actually the model that you're suggesting, you could submit your sort of, in a sense, your plans at an early stage of your work, then that removes part of the sort of the risk, in a sense. You've got from a journal a guarantee that they will publish it, whatever has happened or whatever. So that might be one relevant observation to that. But.
Good point.
Yeah, I think I would also, I wholeheartedly agree with everything you said. Publishing is changing somewhat, both along the lines of what Ben's just described in terms of registering your ideas. There is also a new journal coming on the scene, and I know very little about it, so I'll just mention it so you can take a look at it, called the Rio Journal, which sets out to do exactly this kind of thing and to register ideas. There's another one called, I forget the name, I will look it up later, but it's about publishing very short pieces of science or very small ideas. Patrick?
I think it's called Matters.
Matters, that's it, thank you. The other thing I would also say is I think as a researcher, irrespective of the way publishing operates, you absolutely should be getting credit from your funder, from your institution, or from whoever, for having produced a data set on which 5 other people build extremely quickly. There should be credit built into the system for that as much as for you publishing the 5 papers that someone else may have got to faster.
So Liz, how should that credit work? And it's easy to say your institution should give you credit,
I'm
but
looking
if they
to Mark
don't,
for this one.
it really depends on the community to give you
One of the
credit
things I
before
really
your
like
institution.
is the rise in what are called data journals, where you can actually formally publish a paper about your data set. The underlying then data has to be accessible, and that is then gets you the same recognition as any other published paper. So this is one way of actually citing and tracking usage for data.
Okay, so
After
that's
very
one way,
interesting,
but a data
that's
journal is
not
not going to take a data set that you say you publish a paper in functional ecology.
Yeah.
You put your data in Dryad. A data journal is not going to want that data because it's already out there. How should someone get credit?
You could
Fine.
actually, so
You can do that.
your research paper may have used a portion of the data set you've collected.
Mhm.
You can actually publish the complete data set as a data paper will describe that data
It
set.
doesn't.
Okay.
It doesn't make
Okay.
any like judgments on the data. It doesn't make any assertions. There's no sort of scientific conclusions. You're just describing the data set,
Okay,
and it's
okay.
fine to do that and have a journal paper where you've used a bit of the data and you've proved a hypothesis.
Okay.
So you can get more outputs for your work than if you never made your data open. You just get the one journal paper. You could get your data set published, you could get your data paper, and you can get your journal publication just from one piece of work.
Okay, I sort of always thought of them as separate endeavors, but I was
So
obviously
think
incorrect in that.
I'm behind one of the Collated Data Science Journal is one such journal.
Yeah, excellent. Other comments?
Yeah, I was just going to come in on a couple of issues with your kind of PhD scenario. So nothing you've said there, I don't think, has made me not think that the best thing to have been would have been for those people who have then used your data to have actually talked to you before they used your data and made use of it. So I think I think we're all agreed that that's kind of the ideal. And
So they talk to him and he says, "Oh, I'm just a PhD student, please don't use this," and they go, "Okay, that's fine," and that's the problem sorted, do you think? Or do you think they would just do it anyway, despite talking
well,
to
I
him?
think that could potentially be the problem sorted. I mean, I was actually in that perspective a few years ago from a researcher perspective, using data that was available, and then when we were analysing those data, we realised that a PhD student had a chapter doing something very similar. And in that instance, what we did was then get in touch with the student, talk to her, discussed it, and then basically brought her in as an author on that paper. So she got the kind of credit, and we worked together on that, and that feels like the best, the best solution. But that's only achieved by talking. The second thing I wanted to say in terms of your scenario, where maybe you're a student, you publish your first paper, you've got these other ideas, and then nobody talks to you, and you find out those ideas in the future are example. Wouldn't it be terrible if you then decide? So even if you're getting some kind of recognition, you get a bit fed up with the process and decide, I'm not going to carry on in science, I'm going to go and do something else. And maybe the data set that you were hoping to carry on and develop into a kind of long-term data set then stops. And those other people who rely on analysing your data don't carry that on. That's a general loss to the ecological community, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of protection really for that kind of scenario.
Other thoughts? Questions on this theme?
Yeah, this is a very academic forum. Sorry. It's very academic. There is an awful lot of ecological data which is not collected by universities or by big research institutes, but is in the agency's grey literature, which is not getting into any of these archives. It's maybe being publicly funded, collected in one sense, but it's not often generating papers. So there's no journals requiring that this data is presented. And also, quite often it is dependent on the landowner having given permission for that data to be collected. And that permission may be on condition it is not shared. And even with some big data sets, and I'm thinking here of the CEH land cover, not land
Countryside
cover,
survey.
countryside survey
we
data.
can't publish the location,
Yeah.
but we can publish just about everything else about it, but
Yeah.
that has to be,
But
and we
in
take
ter-
that into account.
So there are issues around, I think, some of this data which is not currently part of this archiving system, and how people can access it without compromising perhaps the ability for people to go back and repeat those surveys, because the landowner said, I'm not letting you on the site again.
I think one of the things we can do there is learn from other disciplines. So one of the previous questions was talking about pre-registering reports, pre-registering ideas in journals, which comes out to biomedical sciences. Here we have in the social sciences, there are actually quite good protocols in place now in terms of how you can share data involving human subjects. Now I think what we need to do is take some of the ideas out of the social and biomedical sciences and work out how we can apply those within some of the ecological communities, about how we can share more openly sensitive data which might identify location of particular farms, etc. So we've got to look outside the immediate box of what we know about and think other people could well have solved some of these problems, not all of them, but I think this involves bringing these sort of people who understand data from a more than one domain together with the community to help sort of try and answer some of these questions.
I would say from the journal perspective, we're constantly learning from the sorts of queries we get when people ask for exemptions. And I can't obviously speak for other journal editors, but I think at the BES, people are trying to be very sympathetic to legitimate concerns of you don't own the data, there's very good reasons why you're collecting your sensitive data, or data just can't be shared. We're sympathetic to that. The main thing we haven't been very sympathetic to is people who don't want to share their data. But legitimate reasons why you can't, I think the journals have been very sympathetic to those. But of course that's on a journal by journal, editor by editor basis. But it's certainly important. Other thoughts on this?
It's fair to say as a fund, we will be sympathetic to those instances as well. We don't want to damage the research process by inappropriately releasing data.
Just
Catherine?
before we move on from etiquette, I just wanted to say that whilst we make data citable, it's still people aren't used to citing data in their journal publications, and that's something that needs to improve over time. People maybe comment in the paper that they've used so-and-so's data or their own data, and because they've got a DOI, but they don't realise they can put it in the references like a regular journal paper. So people need to have clear guidance on how to cite data they've used, whether it's their own or someone else's. And also we need to work on citation metrics so that people can get feedback on the data they've put out there. Who's using it? Is it being used a lot? What is it being used for? Is it a popular data set? And that's going to help, people will get kudos for that because their data is being used a lot, and they'll be able to use that in their career as a sort of developmental kind of thing. So.
Excellent. We're starting to run short on time, so I want to wrap up our sort of last two topics before we get to our final part together. Questions about how we can encourage good data archiving practices, and whoops, I get out of order there. Well, I guess I missed one. What can we do to encourage good data archiving practices, and what can we do to encourage people to actually want to archive their data? Those sort of two things together. Are there thoughts on that?
Mike Whitfield, new vitologist. There's increasingly we're talking about not just static data products, but also processes as well. So when we're talking about derived data sets, and increasingly people are using open source software to create those data sets. So I was wondering if there are any considerations for kind of protocols for introducing those to data archiving practices, as well as the sort of the static data sets themselves.
Comments?
Well, yeah, this is something that we are aware of, and we'd like to be able to collect information on entire workflows, so getting right from the beginning all the way through the statistical analysis, modelling, code, everything, and we'd like to be able to collect that and disseminate it. But it's in the future. It's not something. There's so many issues to deal with at the ground level at the moment, but it is something that we're thinking about in future because we realise how important it is to get all that information. So,
and obviously one of those areas is models and Archigo model code, which again, if we're serious about open science, not only do we need the data to be open, we need the models to be open. And if we thought sharing data was a difficult issue, the amount of intellectual property people invest in the models they develop, you could say is an order of magnitude greater. And we just have to recognise, if we're serious about open research and open science, we've got to find ways around this. There are no easy answers. If you're going to release all your intellectual property, maybe you will get scooped by someone else using your model. So I don't have any answers there. We're just going to start thinking about some of these issues, what it means.
Other questions?
Hi, I came in a bit late, so I'm really sorry if you've covered this already. But on encouraging kind of people to archive their data, I'm coming from the perspective of I use a lot of other people's data, and I'm talking like 40 or 50 published articles in a single one of my single papers. And you mentioned referencing data sets. I find it really hard to do that. I really want to reference every single data set that I use in the main paper so that it's recorded and everyone gets their credit. And that's really difficult with journals at the moment, especially where supplementary information, the citations aren't tracked there either. So, I think moving towards that scenario where either if you're reusing data sets, you're allowed a longer reference list or a separate reference list for all of your data. I think that would be a really good idea, and I was just wondering if we're moving towards that at all.
We should be,
Yeah.
and it is tough. 40 or 50 should be accommodated in most journals. I would say there are a few for which it wouldn't be. When we get into big macroecological analyses with 800 odd references, we do begin to hit some trouble. We are trying to get creative about ways around it. What we really need to be able to do is wherever, if it is an additional file of data references, and ideally it wouldn't be separate, but if it is, we somehow need to get Thomson ISI to look at it, and that's something that we have raised with them.
Maybe we can get Wiley to stop counting references towards our page allocations, and then we can encourage more citation.
Personally don't, but
Yeah.
I know.
A practical comment, if I might. If you've got a long list of references to data files or anything else and you can't fit it in your paper, put it in supplementary information, or cite a link to a database of the references themselves.
But then it's not always tracked. So although I can then feel like I've done my bit by citing everyone's data, it doesn't link back to those authors, so they don't get the credit linked to them, which is what ideally I'd like to happen.
Yes, indeed, but if they're not there at all, then nobody will be able to look them and
Yeah,
cite
of
them
course. I was
directly.
just wondering if we're moving towards supplementary references.
Yes,
being-
we are.
Yeah.
One of the issues that's been sort of concerning me lately, you might have known there was a paper published in PLOS not fairly recently expressing concern about the quality of data in some of the data archives that are out there, that a lot of the data there's not adequate metadata for reuse. Sometimes the data are not even the appropriate data for the paper. There's a variety of problems that make data less usable than they could. And I think that raises an issue of how do we ensure the quality of the data sets that are available, especially when every author is submitting their own data. There's not really a central curation. Organizations like Dryad have minimal curation to make sure files are readable and are there, but nobody's actually proofing the data. What should we be doing as journals, as society, as publishers, as scientists to ensure that the data that's out there is actually quality data and we're doing the community a service rather than creating a lot of noise?
Well, I think you have to pay people to do it. I think that's the problem. It's really hard. We get a broad range of data. The data that's submitted, sometimes it's in a real mess. We spend a lot of time with depositors teasing out things. How is it being described? They spend a lot of time making the supplementary, the supporting documentation. We go through it and check it makes sense with the data. It takes a lot of time. Some people just want a quick DOI for their journal paper. They want to email the data to us, I've done it, can I have my DOI? And we say, no, sorry, it's a bit more involved than that. And that puts a lot of people off. But it needs to be done, or your data's not going to be of a quality that is worth keeping for the long term. But we need funding to do this. It's not. It takes people a lot of time, and it's a job for someone. It has to be done by a specialist who knows the data, who understands the data, and there's just not enough jobs like that around, and funding. People just don't prioritise it as something that's important.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I mean, it is a really important QA issue, and I think as scientists in the scientific community, we do need to be making our data, as robust as possible, and where it's not archived in other sources, making sure that it is. I mean, we at the BTO, that's a large part of some people's jobs are basically checking the data that's coming in and correcting it and dealing with the issues and making sure it's archived properly and so on. And that does take resources, as you were saying, and perhaps recognising the organisations that do already do that.
Okay, I'm told we need to start wrapping up. Let the panel take a few minutes. If you have sort of some final comments you want to make on the issues, what did we learn today? How do you see things moving forward? Just real briefly, a minute or so each, if you will. James.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of solutions and taking things forward, I think we should continue to promote collaboration and encourage communication between researchers. And I think we've talked about that. I think we're all in agreement that that's a good thing, but it's not very easy to do. And I do wonder, whether your suggestion of about perhaps having a tick box on paper submission, so at least it's clear whether a particular submission has involved communication with the data originators might be one way forward, at least until as a kind of carrot to try and help achieve the kind of societal and community change that we're looking for. I think the embargoes, and maybe having for certain data sets, for some of the kind of longer term data sets which can be used to address multiple questions, having perhaps more of standard longer term embargoes on those can potentially help. And I am encouraged by what I've heard here about the potential flexibility from journals and from funders to kind of consider reasons for that. And I think really, we shouldn't kind of shy away from the fact that these are difficult issues. I think we're all kind of trying to push forward to try and make the best of the data that we've got and the best of the science that we can do. And but we do need to, whilst there's a journey and a push towards open data for lots of good reasons, I think we need to be aware and robust to where it's not working and to try and deal with the problems rather than saying, oh, that's just inevitable because that's our current direction of travel.
Catherine.
I've been really pleased to hear that people are reusing data, that people do want to share their data and do want to make it open, so that's been really positive. There are a lot of issues, we've touched on them today, but I don't think that should stop us moving forward. Just what James said, really, that there are things that need to be sorted. We are working on these things. I think data centres, journal publishers and research need to get together to, like we have done today, to iron out some of these issues, because maybe people don't know these issues are being discussed, or people are trying to solve these issues. So yeah, getting together and working together to try and push forward on this would be great.
Yeah, very quick summary from me would be this is really hard. But I think, again, what you guys have both just said, which is that shouldn't stop us from doing it. I think it's much better, rather than sitting and moaning and writing opinion pieces about how awful everything is, we should try and think of like positive ways of sort of moving forwards, even if they're very small baby steps. At least we're making some steps in the right direction.
I would agree we're making steps forward in the right direction. If we'd had this meeting 2, 3, 4 years ago, we would have had much more negative opinions expressed in the room. Unlike James, I'd actually like to see us move to shorter, no embargoes, and I see embargoes at the moment as an accommodation to help deal with people's valid concerns around data sharing, but hopefully in time we can show that as a research community, the vast majority of people are very trustworthy. And to the point about protocols, the future that I see once we get to our zero embargoes and everything works fantastically is that we move further and further upstream in the process of research when we begin to gather information about these things that exist, and we include much more about protocols, workflows, and all of that kind of thing too.
So early next year we'll be seeing the publication of UK Concordat and Open Research data, which has been developed by universities, funders, publishers, learned societies who are across the sector, which again will help start to push the debate forward. I think to me there's a real role here for learned societies like the BES in helping us now develop some of these community norms. You know, as funders we can say one thing, it's how that's turned into real positive action on the ground in the community at large. So I think if we can involve learned societies, that would be really useful.
Excellent. Well, thanks to our panelists for coming today. Thanks to everyone who came to participate and listen to the discussion. I certainly learned a lot. I like hearing the diversity of perspectives. I think it's clear that there are many aspects of data that are clearly moving down the right track, but there are lots of challenges for us to address. Data quality, data citation, ensuring that people have use of their data before their data are used by others, sensitive data, things of that sort that we still need to hash out. I hope that we can keep having constructive discussions and get to a point where basically everybody is enthusiastic about it and we've solved all of our world's problems. Maybe we could do it in this one small realm since we can't do it in the broader world, but that's certainly our goal. Thank you all for coming and participating in our discussion. Thanks to everyone